you hear me? Can you hear me fine? I don't know if this microphone is on, but I'll keep speaking anyways.
Yeah, no,
That's good? Okay. So thank you all for coming. Si vous avez besoin, est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un ici qui a besoin de la traduction vers le français? Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un ici qui n'est pas confortable en anglais? Parce qu'on offre un service de traduction chuchotage, c'est Acti qui est en arrière. Alors si vous voulez avoir la traduction, s'il vous plaît, n'hésitez pas. Okay, so we're going to start just by acknowledging that we are on Ganagahaga territory here. And the Ganagahaga are the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This island here called Montreal is known as Teotihuacan in the language of the Ganagahaga, and it has historically been a meeting place for other indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe peoples. I think that's all we're going to say for right now, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Christian of Climate Justice Montreal, who is going to...
Okay, great. Good. Thank you, everyone, for showing up on this beautiful evening. Everyone could also be sitting on a terrace somewhere or playing volleyball, but we are here, and so I salute you. And maybe we can also give a warm round of applause to welcome our speakers and also, as well as Paula, because Paula also came and drove in from Halifax at the drop of a pin when we saw that our other speaker, Cheryl Maloney, was not able to come. So actually, I think it's a really important story to say that Paula and Madonna decided just like that 2 days ago to drive all the way up from Halifax to tell you about the issue. So let's maybe give them a round of applause. A long drive and no small thing. So just to jump right in, why we're here tonight. I think there is lots of chaos and a lot of big issues around the world, and we see that fueling our everyday lives with oil, gas, and coal. At least the people here in this room, we realize how destructive that is, that it's fueling really massive environmental changes that are disturbing ocean atmospheric circulation patterns, fueling melting ice caps, and not only massive natural environmental change, also driving enormous social injustice to some of the most vulnerable peoples on the planet. So that's the context, that imbalance, that legacy of colonialism and capitalism. And so that's really what our group, Climate Justice Montreal, that context is really what's brought us together to organize events like this one and bringing amazing people like Freddy and Madonna and Paula as well, who are really very courageous and standing up to protect their waters and defend their land, given the enormity of the capital that's invested and the gargantuan nature of that machine. And so in terms of slowing down that machine and in terms of treading more lightly on the earth, governments have tried to do all sorts of things, Paris Climate Accord and so on and so forth. But we already see that even after the Paris Climate Accord was signed, billions of dollars have been put into new fossil fuel projects. And so it looks like politics is not enough to stop or slow down that destruction. And so that's why pressuring the financial institutions and the banks and finance capital in general is really important. Money talks. And that's where the divestment movement really gets a lot of its power. To pressure investors to take money out of the fossil fuel industry and invest it in sectors that are better for the people and the planet. So the divestment movement, if most of you, I imagine, are familiar with it, if you're not, you need to know that it really did begin in universities. McGill was a major pioneer, but it didn't stop there. After that, you can read about all of this story, Rockefeller Foundation divesting, pension funds all over the place that are divesting from fossil fuels. We're starting to see the dominoes beginning to fall. In Quebec this summer, a coalition of citizens and organizations clustered around a really major institutional investor here in Quebec, the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, which is the second largest pension fund in Canada. It's a massive sovereign wealth fund that invests up to more than $250 billion. But we've seen since the Paris Climate Accords that they've actually increased their investments in fossil fuels from 7% to 9.7% of their portfolio, which is around $16 billion. And that's really vital cash that those companies need to continue their drilling activities on the ground. And so without that cash, they can't go forward. And that's why we have land defenders who stand up and try to stop some of that, stop those projects from going forward. So CJM, Climate Justice Montreal, we support that Sortons la Caisse du Carbone campaign, get the Caisse out of carbon. You know, because it's really about pushing society to transition away from fossil fuels. Because really, what good is a pension fund? What good is a pension for you when it puts the health and the well-being of your children and grandchildren at such high risk? This is what one of our friends put on our Facebook wall a few days ago. So in that context, the divestment movement is picking up steam, and First Nations across Turtle Island, North America, are launching major divestment campaign across, urging the globe to divest from fossil fuels in a campaign called Mazaska Talks that we'll hear Isabelle Letti speak about at the end, very briefly. But you know, behind all the numbers and behind all the money that we want to get out of carbon, there are so many stories of communities on the front lines that are fighting back against fossil fuel companies. There's so many examples. The Caisse has money in BP, so we know the Deepwater Horizon blowout that is still affecting the United Huma Nation off the coast of Louisiana. There's Chevron Corporation that dumped billions of gallons of toxic wastewater in the rivers and streams of the Ecuadorian Amazon, which prompted a multi-year lawsuit by the indigenous peoples of that region. There's the Colonial Pipeline Company, whose pipeline in 2016 exploded, killing 1 person and 5 people. You know, just working class folk who are trying to put bread on the table. And then of course, there's the Kinder Morgan pipeline in BC, which is being resisted intensely by the tiny house warriors, which I would encourage you to go and look up. It's a really amazing example, very inspiring example of First Nations people and their allies standing up against pipelines. And then of course in Quebec we have Energy East, which looks like has been actually stopped. Which is obviously a good thing, but there's a lot of money that is trying to go through Keystone XL. So there's a lot of these stories, so that's why we invited Freddy to come today, and we invited Madonna as well. We're going to be focusing on, well, they're going to be more talking about their direct experience, but you must realize that what they're standing up against are 2 companies that are funded by the Caisse. From Freddy's example and his Mi'kmaq friends and colleagues is Junex, which is a company from Quebec that is drilling in the Gaspé Peninsula, and that according to the Caisse's 2016 report, they have $5.2 million in this junior oil company. But that has caused a lot of controversy in Gaspé. Quebeckers do not want fossil fuels. And so Freddy was directly involved in solidarity with the Mi'kmaq and the other allies against Junex. So we'll have Freddy talk a little bit about his experience at the barricade this past summer. And he was also a key organizer in Unsettling Canada, which was a campaign that happened this past summer in Ottawa, and is also active across Canada to really put into question some of our own colonial heritage as settlers, and to make us remember the importance of First Nations people and their vital contribution and ongoing contribution to our society. So Freddy Stoneypoint is an Anishinaabe activist and student from Sagamok, just outside of Sault Ste. Marie. Am I pronouncing that? Sagamok Anishinaabe, yes. Ojibwe man. And so he will talk about his experience. But before we get to that, I will also introduce Madonna Bernard, who is Mi'kmaq from just outside of Wagamama, which is what we have come to call Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. And they have been organizing against Alton Gas, a company from Alberta that has been wanting to make huge reservoirs to store natural gas. But those naturally occurring reservoirs, if they put the gas in them, it would eject many gallons of salt brine water into the local rivershed, which is very disastrous for the local wildlife, but also their culture, which is based on subsistence, hunting and fishing and gathering in those areas. And so Madonna will talk about the resistance camp that they set up and that is still going strong outside of outside the Alton gas storage. So I don't want to talk too much about their stories. I'm going to definitely leave them the time to do so. And so without further ado, in that case, we will hear from Freddy, and then after that we will hear from Madonna. Then Kathy and I have a few questions for them to tease out some of the nuances and to ask them, to talk about their story in further detail, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and other comments. Does that sound good, everybody? Okay, so Freddy, let's hear from you.
Ani, Sargasiga Dishka Dishnikas, Skamakanishnabeck Donjabak, Ego Quadonum. My name is Freddy Stoneypoint. My spirit name means rays of light shining from the sky. I'm from Sagamakanishnabeck, and I'm from the mermaid clan as well. Right now, I guess I'm an academic at Carleton University, and I'm currently studying sociology. And university was pretty formative for me understanding and contextualizing, my place as an Anishinaabe person, within the realm of settler colonialism. And, settler colonialism, it's one of the most insidious, acts that can ever be done, to a people, which is, putting up structures, over indigenous forms of nationhood, and dispossessing and expropriating indigenous land, to put up at heart settler structures. And also, the question of land is something that I'm primarily concerned with as an indigenous person, because for us, I guess I shouldn't really go into pan-indigeneity, but for me as an Ojibwe person, land isn't this Lockean notion of property that's supposed to be gutted and mined and developed upon. It's actually a living, breathing, and engendered entity as well. So I think a lot of times with settler colonialism, I think there's a distinction to be made between the two ontologies of how the settler colonial state of KK Canada views land versus how Indigenous people all over Turtle Island see land. And for Indigenous people, no one owns the land, like we belong to it, and we have a responsibility to the land as well. And through school, I was able to learn certain legal technologies that were enacted against us as Indigenous people. This entire nation, the settler sovereignty of KK Canada, was founded off racist legal fictions like Terra Nullius and the Doctrine of Discovery. And I think the thing that I really want to convey to everyone here is that you don't have the title to this land. This land is indigenous. And this land is still indigenous because that settler sovereignty hasn't been settled, like even within the legal parameters of Canadian legal spheres. KK Canada broke its own rules, especially in terms of treaties and all those acts of illegal expropriation. So if more people knew how many land struggles were happening on Turtle Island, the question of land would not be so settled. But of course, media, in terms of how they cover Indigenous resistance, there's a political economy that demonstrates, the anxiety that, the settler colonial state of Canada has about Indigenous nationhood. These acts of resistance, they're often rendered invisible because of that question of land. Land was never settled. So I guess for myself, contextualizing my place on Turtle Island as an Ojibwe person, as someone original, once you learn those theories and those frameworks in university, there comes a certain point where you have to stop talking the talk and actually walking the walk, and putting that praxis into action. One of my friends has a good definition for praxis within academia. It's the understanding an academic has in that they'll know the theory, but they'll never put it into practice. And I see that a lot at university, within academia. And honestly, that's why I fucking hate Carleton University. And that's why I hate all universities. Like, I hate the university structure generally. And I think, because this is Indigenous land, and because universities, produce these colonial economies and ideologies, for myself, I think, Turtle Island would be a lot better if they just burned down every university. But with that being said, I was involved in this action during Canada Day. That wouldn't have happened actually if I hadn't gone to university, because that's where I picked up a lot of my networks. So I'm not gonna completely shit on university. It does have some good things. I'll get into that later. But putting this framework and this theory into praxis, understanding that myself as an Indigenous person, I guess it depends where I go, territory-wise, but generally, I know myself, I have a superseding jurisdiction on Turtle Island, and that's how we operated in this one action on Canada Day, where basically during 150, which is a celebration of Indigenous genocide, it was just a slap in the face, and it was honestly a form of psychological torture, seeing all these Canada 150 insignias all over Ottawa. So for myself, I often think in terms of what can I do, to help. And if all these structures are in place and all these processes, through neoliberal economies or market capital, all these structures, like the extractive industry structure, economic development, and also the legal justice system, and the cops and courts, all these structures are in place, and they're foreign to Turtle Island, and they're responsible for the subjugation and elimination of Indigenous nationhood and sovereignty, self-determination, autonomy. What is the way? If Turtle Island has all these structures, how do you remove all that? And for me, it's decolonization. It's restoring Indigenous nationhood. Rematriating land back to Indigenous women. So I think until the nation-state structure, remains solidified within KK Canada, Indigenous people will always be, constant threat of elimination. I also really enjoy talking about necropolitics. I don't know if anyone has ever read necropolitics in here. Okay, I'll go into it really quick. But basically, I believe there's a necropolitical dynamic that's currently happening against Indigenous people in Canada. So necropolitics, I'll go into this really quick, but there's a South African philosopher, his name was Akile Membe, and what he did was he extrapolated a lot of his ideas from Michel Foucault, who wrote about biopower, and how sovereignty can be used to manage and regulate populations of people, except Akile Membe took it up a step further, and he talked about how sovereignty can be also used where the greatest expression of sovereignty is to be able to make live or make die. And right now, I definitely believe there are necropolitical mechanisms in place against Indigenous people because, violence is an inherent characteristic of settler sovereignty in Canada. So that's why I believe transformative decolonization, of the Canadian structure, as long as that structure remains in place, we're going to be in a state of exception, and that's why that's why they say there's an ongoing genocide against Indigenous people, and that's a project by the Canadian state to eliminate us, for that securement of land. So wherever I go, I'm always thinking in terms of that decolonial framework and understanding those necropolitical mechanisms that are in place against us. So I think the first opportunity I had to put this praxis into action was during Canada Day. And people don't know what happened. We had a reoccupation ceremony on Parliament Hill that was organized between four core members, four core organizers from Carleton University, Summer Twenish, who's from Kitigan-Zibi, and Trisha Baznet, who's a settler from Abitibi, and also Hamda Daria, who's Somali, who has roots in Somalia. So understanding that we have a supersede jurisdiction, even in the city, we were looking for people to partner with in action in terms of getting that TP on Parliament and unsettling that urban space. So I'm from Sagamuk-Anishinaabe, which is Ojibwe territory, and there's a group of water protectors called the Bawating Water Protectors, led by Canada State Navy. And they were also planning a very ambitious action for Canada Day. So, thinking in terms of sovereignty, resurgence, and how do we move even in the city in terms of unsettling? And the best way to do that is through ceremony. Ceremony is an inherent aspect within, Indigenous nationhood. And if you look at any kind of blockade, there's always an aspect of ceremony that stakes up our jurisdiction. You'll see sage, you'll see sacred fires, tobacco is, central, and, it goes beyond spiritual as well, it's political. Because ceremony in the past, as recently as the mid-century, ceremony was criminalized. And for myself, I do subscribe to a direct action ethos. And that's what I think probably did happen on Parliament, was a direct action. But the language of how you proceed in terms of direct action is very important. Because we avoided the language of protest and demonstration, and we operated within this framework that it was all ceremony. But even that can be fraught with peril, because the first night we actually entered Parliament was about 4 days before Canada Day, and I was also one of the 9 arrested as well. So. And it was pretty violent. A few of our women were dragged off violently. They also tried to drag away one of our Cree grandmothers that we had participating in this really radical direct action. They actually tried to drag her off as well. And that just conveys a broader anxiety that, KK Canada has about Indigenous jurisdiction. But I'm not sure, what the underlying dynamics were, but they allowed us to stay, and eventually they allowed us to leave. So I think right now we're living in this reconciliation era, where we have the politics of recognition, where the state is trying to reconcile its own illegal sovereignty with the fact that Indigenous people were here first, and that we had, sophisticated forms of governance and laws and systems of societal organization within our own indigenous communities, all of that supersedes any kind of, Westphalian notion of sovereignty. So, putting that framework and that praxis into action, I was very surprised that a framework started to develop during Canada Day, where, spaces can be unsettled, even in urban spatialities, if Indigenous people lead with ceremony. So, also for myself, I do consider what is the place of an ally. And I fucking hate that term, allies. I prefer to use accomplices instead. But, what can an accomplice do in terms of helping restore Indigenous nationhood? I think one thing that needs to be done is people need to stop thinking of this land as settled, and, because even the idea of the nation state in Canada, it's a modern paradigm. I mean, we've had nations or empires that have lasted thousands of years, but Canada, it's a recent modern construction. It's only 150 years since the consolidation of the Dominion of Canada, and it can be settled. People need to really, especially settlers, need to unsettle their expectations in pursuit of a new form of settler uncertainty, as one of my professors from Carleton would say, Ibonaki. Because without unsettling those expectations, you're not going to be a real ally or accomplice or any kind of help for Indigenous people if you're invested in that structure that is reproducing, oppression and genocide against Indigenous people. So, for myself, for accomplices, I want to turn the focus into the restoration of Indigenous nationhood. Returning land that was stolen illegally back to Indigenous women, and I think that's my expectation for allies as well, because this land isn't fucking yours. It's ours. This is Indigenous land, and even though I'm from a different territory. That doesn't change the fact that I'm Indigenous to Turtle Island, and I know that's a pretty abrasive opinion. For instance, I had an interview lined up with CBC this morning, and the pre-interview was yesterday, and I went full on into this decolonization shit, and then she was like, oh, okay. That might be a bit much for AM, but maybe we can get you in the afternoon instead. But unfortunately, they just totally kiboshed the whole interview. So I know this is a lot to take in terms of unsettling your expectations, but it's absolutely crucial if you're going to help Indigenous people. So I guess I'll go into Junex just a little bit. I don't know how much time I have left. 5 minutes, okay. 5 minutes, okay. Yeah, okay. So 5 minutes. For myself, working within that framework of decolonization, right now I think one of the most lethal mechanisms in place against Indigenous people is, the resource extraction industry, which, reproduces those necropolitical mechanisms, because violence on the land is violence against women, because land unlocks so many potentials for Indigenous people in terms of restoring languages, returning to Indigenous laws, reclaiming those responsibilities that we had to the animals as well. Land is a vector for so many things, and when you have a resource extraction that is constantly encroaching on Indigenous lands, this manifests in ways that people don't even think about, thinking about the social indicators of oppression, such as addiction, suicide, the child welfare industry complex. All of these are a result of that dispossession, that loss of land. So, resource extraction companies right now are encroaching on land, and this is manifesting with social issues against us. So that's why I believe wherever I go, I understand resource I understand extraction as a structure that doesn't like adhere to any kind of territory or province. Like pipelines stretch across territories and provinces. So if you have an opportunity, I guess if I have an opportunity to intervene or to disrupt any aspect of that, of that resource, economic, whatever structure, for myself, I see it as a responsibility that I have, since that structure leads back to my territory. I see it as a responsibility of mine to, disrupt and, choke out whatever I can. So, with that being said, I also understand that, part of the revolution for Indigenous people is establishing those new relationships and making those new connections. So whenever I get a chance to work out a territory, like I always jump at it. Like I really enjoy, making those new connections and relationships. I guess I'm fairly limited what I can share about Junex or June exit, but I'll say at the time I was kind of, expressing my sovereignty and nationhood, and before the siege happened, I did have a sacred fire up there, and I was burning sage and tobacco, and all I was doing at the time of the arrest was surviving on the land. That's all I was doing. So that just conveys a few things, the distinction that's to be made between ontologies of how Indigenous people view the land versus how settler colonial industries view the land as, just a commodity. So we have like these differing ontologies and these struggles and these conflicts taking place on Turtle Island. But I guess the thing that I really want to get across is that Indigenous people are here first, and in terms of direct action and helping Indigenous people, I personally don't believe NGOs, not to shit on why we're here, but I don't believe NGOs are the solution. I think radical direct action is the solution, and cutting up the middleman and choking out that project immediately. That's how you're actually gonna transformatively affect that structure. And the best way to do that in terms of direct action is making those new relationships and also leading with Indigenous women in all your, in how you proceed against extractive industries, because Indigenous women and nationhood, they were here first, and that question of land was never settled, and settler sovereignty is illegal. So support grassroots movements, and I guess that's it. Thanks for listening.
So that's questions for afterwards. So we'll jump right into Madonna and hear from her and some of the struggles that are happening out farther east in Mi'kmaq territory.
I don't know if I can keep up with that. Nina Delo si kukugas mo sa Sapukia Unumagi. My spirit name is Naidalo, and I'm from Quebec. I grew up with very strong ethics on our treaty rights. I grew up in a warrior family. My uncles fought in Oka with the Mohawks during the Oka crisis, and so I grew up that way. It didn't just happen. But also, I wanted to talk a lot about not only what's going on with Alton Gas, but pretty much all of it. My first, I would say, our first fight with these fracking companies was in Cape Breton, and it was against a company called Petroleum. And Petroleum is a small junior fracking company that wanted to come in and frack the largest freshwater lake in Cape Breton. And it was awesome how it happened, how we beat them, and we beat them really fast because we totally done it on a grassroots level, and we ignored the chiefs, the INAC chiefs, and we ignored the governments, and we done it on a grassroots level and an ally. But we won, and it was so quick how we beat them. We didn't have the chiefs' support because they were signing permits left and right with these big corporations through it's called KMK. It's a Mi'kmaq organization that deals with Mi'kmaq rights. But the thing with this organization is that we didn't give them consent on our behalf, to speak on our behalf, on our treaty rights, on our children's treaty rights, on our grandchildren's treaty rights. So that was the beautiful thing about it, how we beat that. And then we were up in Elsipogtog. We were fighting against Swin. Again, there, that one was a little bit more harder, and because they were trying to, because it was not our territory, first of all. It was Mi'kmaq territory, but not our district territory. And there's different districts. And so anyways, we were up there, and they were trying to make negotiations with the chiefs up there during the time. But we did it. We won. You know, Swin left after a couple, I would say about 6 months. But after a bunch of us got arrested, and one thing in court, when you go to court and you use sovereignty and you use those words like unceded Mi'kmaq territory, when you use those words in court, they are terrified of those words, very terrified, because they know they don't own the land, and they have no documentation of that. So there's nothing that they have no proof. They have not one shred of proof saying that we ceded our land in Mi'kmaq. They don't have no proof of that. And Canada, the corporation, we'll call it as it is, it's Canada, the corporation, because they have a corporate number, and they have to file in Washington, D.C. every year with that corporate number, because they know us as the Mi'kmaq, we never unceded that territory. So they're not a nation, we're the nation. We are this nation. And Canada Corporation is nothing but a corporation that go to different countries like Guatemala, Bangladesh, and they go and they mine all these countries, and they kill a lot of people there. And so I'm just calling as it is. We got to start using these words at a grassroots level. We are, I know this is Mohawk territory, but in our territory, we never unceded our territory at all. And I'm just trying to say a lot of things all at once, but it is what it is. We got to start using these words like we've been assimilated. Our own people have been assimilated, brainwashed into thinking that Canada runs this country, and they don't. Because we've been winning all these fights at a grassroots level and an ally level, and we've been beating them left, right, and center. I went to court for my case against Swin, and I won, but I won with treaty. I went to court 6 times, and every time I used sovereignty, I used unceded Mi'kmaq territory, and they couldn't, so they had to throw it out. I had absolute discharge in there. I just had a granddaughter recently, so if they think I'm fighting now for my treaty rights, I'm fighting even harder now for her treaty rights. For, not just for ourselves, we do this for all of us. This is why we say we are all treaty people. All this land that you guys are paying property taxes on, it's stolen land. So why are you paying property taxes on land that's stolen, that don't even belong to Canada? These governments gotta understand, when they talk, they say traditional Mi'kmaq territory. They're using these words because they're twisting them around. It's not traditional Mi'kmaq, well, I know we're in Mohawk territory, but in Mi'kmaq territory, when they say those words, like when Stephen McNeil says those words, traditional Mi'kmaq territory, he's trying to twist it around because it's Mi'kmaq unceded territory. So they do use these little words. And when KMK, that's the Mi'kmaq Rights Initiative, when they come in and they speak to the 13 chiefs of our Mi'kmaq territory, the INAC system, I like to call it, KMK to me is funded by oil and gas, first of all. And these 13 chiefs come in and they get handed a document which deals with all of our treaty rights. And they're told, you gotta sign this document or you can't leave with this check. So to me, I call KMK an offshore bank account for the INAC chiefs. Plain and simple, that's the way I look at it, that's the way I see it. And nobody can tell me that I'm speaking wrong, because I know that's what it is. It's an offshore bank account for these chiefs. And they're getting away with it because the rest of the people are living in poverty. You know, it sucks. You know, the people feel like they have to go out and get jobs in oil and gas because they don't have nothing else to go to. But we can fix all this. We can build our economy. We can build solar farms. We can build hemp farms. We have to, at a grassroots level, we have to build all our people up. We have to live on this land together. You know, and we can do it in harmony with Mother Earth, and we can do it together. You know, we can. And there's no other way I see it. That's the only way I see us protecting Mother Earth. This is what we have to do. And I ain't gonna stop. I won't stop. I look at my granddaughter and I see what we have to do and what we have to go up against. We have to go up against these corporations and call them out for what they are. You know, we have to follow the 7 sacred teachings because it's our inherent right. It's in our DNA to protect, and that's what we do. This is why we do what we do. You know, don't question it. It's in our DNA to protect Mother Earth. It's in our DNA to protect all for future generations. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so actually, Madonna, as you were speaking, I mean, it's so interesting all the time to hear these stories. And as I was doing a bit of research about some of the resistance happening in Mi'kma'ki, then Mi'kma'ki is that's like the land Mi'kmaq territory. So I was struck by the spokespeople for all this Alton gas project, which is actually similar to. That's fine. I'm gonna ask you about it, and you can talk about it. And it's similar to a project that Junex or Petroleum. Yes. similar to a Junex project 1 hour outside of Montreal, where they want to store natural gas in salt caverns, underground, naturally occurring salt caverns. Doing this is quite advantageous for the company because it basically amounts to speculation. They stock the gas in these underground chambers, and when the prices of the gas are high, they release it and they sell it off and they make more money. So they want to do, Junex wants to do a similar project up in Baie-Comecourt. The difference, though, there are probably a few differences, but one of the differences is that they want to release the brine and the salt water into the local rivers. So if you could talk a little bit about, you talked about some of the traps that they set, I'd like to hear that. But in Quebec, just to close that parenthesis, the company, using the classic greenwashing corporate social responsibility language, wants to find an ecological use for all that salt water that they're going to push out of the salt caverns. They want to use that to put on our roads in the wintertime, which is, instead of throwing it into the rivers to kill fish, we'll put it on the roads and we don't have to mine salt. So it's environmental, but maybe it's better than killing all the fish, but maybe not much better. So could you talk a bit about, I heard a bit about this treaty truck house that you and your colleagues and your peers all set up to resist Alton gas. Yeah, it was just nice to hear a little bit about what was that like, who was there, what did you set up, maybe some of the conflicts you had with some company personnel. The company personnel, and just one last second, I was bemused, I was disgusted. In their corporate speak, they said, the spokesperson for the company, in reference to the resistance, said that we respect the right of individuals to express their views in a safe manner. So, I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think you're just an individual who has a freedom of opinion? From what you and Freddy are saying, you're like the sovereign people of this land. So, just kind of curious to hear you talk more about the treaty truck house, that story about the traps you were talking to us about before, and let us know what you think about that comment. It would be really awesome.
So we've been fighting Alton gas for about 3 years now, but last year we put up a treaty truck house. A treaty truck house in our 1752 treaty, under section 4, says that we can put up a truck house anywhere we see fit to put up a truck house, as Mi'kmaq people. And we saw it fit to put it right in front of Alton gas, where they wanted the brine. So we did. And they were trying to make it really hard for us. They sent security down, and they told us that we had to take the lumber all the way around. So we were doing that in the beginning, but then 2 young girls, my daughter and Michelle Paul's daughter, they had yellow tape. Alton Gas had yellow tape striped across, and all they did was lift it up